Arcade Heroes.
Greetings, it's Adam with ArcadeHeroes.com and Irata Non Grata, which is my home console focused channel. Lots of Atari stuff there, but today's news kind of fits both console and arcade, so that's where I'm going to be doing this for both channels. But if you're interested in following me for any console related things, lots of Atari stuff, then you can follow me on Irata Non Grata. Anyways, yesterday, March 16th, Atari SA, which is the company that handles all the home console stuff that you'll see an Atari logo on, they own the IP for a lot of games that originated with Atari back in the 70s and 80s for arcades, Atari 2600 through the Jaguar, all that stuff. They made an announcement that they acquired 12 classic arcade games. But within the press release, they only mentioned 2 of them, Berzerk and Frenzy. Well, I reached out to Uber Strategist, the PR firm that Atari uses, and they were kind enough to give me the full list, and here it is. So the 12 titles, as is not much of a surprise, all belong to Stern Electronics games. And so I can understand why they may not have mentioned these originally, because except for Berzerk, all of them are fairly obscure, and even retro gamers may not know a lot of these. But let me go through the list in case you're curious. If you've not heard of them yourself or played them. For me personally, I've only played one of them on an arcade cabinet. I've played some others in emulation, or I've just not ever really come across them. But again, they were proper coin-operated arcade games. So first we had Armored Car, which is a game where you control an armored car and you're trying to pick up money that's laying in the road out in the city and trying to get it to the bank without running into a bank robber car or some other hazard. And of course you have gas, so you gotta pick up gas every now and then. And so this is a fun little game, but again, obscure. I'm not aware of any home ports that this one ever received, like with most of Stern's video games. But also one thing to point out, none of these are pinball machines. It's all just video games. The second one is Atomic Castle, a Laserdisc game, and I can't remember. I should have checked the article that I recently edited for Kevin Williams, published on ArcadeHeroes.com, that talked about the history of Laserdiscs in arcades. And I can't remember if Stern did more than just this one, but could have some interesting things that they do with this. One thing to also mention is that Atari said that they were looking at reinvigorating, re-energizing, remaking these games for the new generation and giving them digital and physical distribution. One thing that would be cool is if they offered like a DLC pack for the Atari 50th anniversary collection, so that these could all be added to the arcade section. Nice. But any remakes, could be interesting to see what they could do with Atomic Castle. As there was, say, the Spectre Files Deathstalker, which was a Laserdisc arcade game and released to Steam a little while ago. But then Berzerk is on the list, and I've had that playing. Everybody knows that one out of all these. Next one is Dark Planet in 3D, which was an early stereoscopic 3D game. Here's what the CLOV entry shows for it. I've, again, never seen one. I love the artwork on the cabinet, though. That is really nice, and almost looks like what Atari was doing back in 82 through 84 when they were putting very elaborate, very detailed, very nice artwork on their cabinets. But this one, it's kind of like Asteroids from the description I've read. Again, I've not played this particular one, even in emulation, but it sounds like it's one you would want to play on a cabinet if you could ever find one, but I didn't even see this one at California Extreme when I went a few years ago. Then we have Frenzy, which is the sequel to Berzerk. Again, not as well known. I'm not sure how many consoles actually got a port of Frenzy, but it allowed you to shoot walls. Again, the original Berzerk, if you touched any wall, you died, but you couldn't shoot through them. And so I guess it was one of the first games to have destructible environments. But of course, Berzerk and Frenzy both had voice synthesis. They weren't the first games to do it, but they were among the first to use that. And Frenzy introduced more enemies than just the same looking robots and changing their color, so that was nice. It's Great Guns. This one is not many people may think of the 80s as having a lot of arcade light gun games. I mean, there's, of course, Wild Gunman, which was in the Back to the Future movies, and a couple of others, but it's even escaping my mind. As anytime I think of light gun arcade games, I think of games from the 90s or more recent times. But Great Guns was one of the, among the first. It wasn't the first light gun game. That was actually Atari's Quack. But Great Guns allowed two per the cabinet and was in full color, which throughout the 70s there were a few light gun games, but they were all black and white, and they were almost always single player, not two player. Great Guns was a kind of a shooting gallery game with carnival style graphics and such, but that's another one that I've never played in person. But in talking about this one, one thing I'd hope to see Atari do with this is maybe license some of these out so that they could be remade as arcade games once again. Great Guns probably would do all right in that regard. I mean, light gun games are generally going to be a surefire hit, and you know, this shooting gallery style, you could almost be like a point blank style game if anybody was interested in that. But for those who may not know, Atari has licensed stuff out for arcade use in recent times. So Centipede Chaos, which was developed by Play Mechanics and released through a company called Ice. Ice is best known for their dome or bubble hockey games, and they were also, last summer they were testing out a new Asteroids licensed by Atari, but I was told it failed testing, so it's apparently not happening unless they maybe rework it massively. Or there was the Atari Pong game, the electromechanical Pong, that was released through Unis. And so Atari is interested in licensing things out, so it certainly is a possibility. So among these, I mean, hard to say which ones might work the best for a modern arcade, but Great Guns, given it's a light gun game, maybe that could. The next one, this might be the most famous game among the list of Stern games from the 80s, aside from Berzerk, and that's Lost Tomb. It's essentially the Indiana Jones without being Indiana Jones. And it's possibly the first video game to ever feature a character with a whip, so before Castlevania, and your whip is super powerful because it could destroy walls. So you couldn't do that in Castlevania exactly. Well, I guess with certain secret areas you could, but not quite like in Lost Tomb, where you're going through some ancient ruins and collecting treasures and all that. So that could end up being an interesting one as a recharged title, or maybe an arcade one. Mazer Blazer. This one, I first learned about this from watching old episodes of Starcade. That was a TV game show where people went and played some certain arcade games, and the person who would win their own full-sized arcade machine. And so, can't remember how long that went on in the 80s, but in catching up on episodes several years ago, I found it pretty fascinating and fit my like and enjoyment of arcades. But they had Mazer Blazer on there, and that was a game that I'd never seen, never heard of. Didn't realize at first that it was a Stern game, because Atari Ireland actually licensed this out for distribution within Europe, and so they gave it their Atari cabinet style, as you can see from the flyer here. And the game itself, it's kind of a defensive game. So you take hold of this bizarre looking ray gun like joystick slash turret cannon thing, and you are aiming it at the enemies on the screen that are moving through the maze, and they're moving towards the central area, and you just have to blast them. As I recall, you can blast some other things, but this also might make an interesting remake. May need some enhancement changes, but it would certainly stand out from what's out there in the light gun market these days. Give it some modernized graphics and whatnot. That could be cool. Otherwise, if it comes out on home consoles at some point, it would probably work fine with an analog stick, although may feel better if there was a trackball, but I don't know of any trackball controllers for anything other than PZs at this point. Next up is Minefield, which was a game that made interesting use of parallax scrolling, where you had different layers that created an illusion of depth, almost 3D-ish in that sense, kind of like Moon Patrol. I think Moon Patrol might have been the first game to do parallax scrolling, but if not, then a game like Minefield was one of the first. But in Minefield, you can control a tank, and it's driving along a minefield, but you also have missiles that you can pick up, and you're shooting at these planes that are up in the sky, shooting them down, trying to keep them from shooting you, and you also have so many miles to go before you get to your next objective, and just keep trucking along there. So I could see how that could be fun and interesting. And I'll jump ahead a little bit to mention that the other game that's on the Atari/Stern list, called Rescue, seemed to use the same kind of engine. Then again, I should have looked up at first which game came first, Minefield or Rescue. I'm not sure. But in Rescue, instead of driving a tank, you're flying a helicopter, and in that sense, it's a lot like Defender, where you are attacking enemies, and then guys fall into the sea, and you have to rescue the guys at sea, but they can be attacked by sharks. Once you pick them up, then there's an island you have to drop them off onto. For any retro gamers out there, if you've played the game Choplifter, then it's kind of like that, just with its own unique twists and differences to it. And so both of those war-based games would be interesting recharge titles as well. Then we have Moon War, which in a way the gameplay is kind of sort of like Asteroids if I was to try and find something to compare it to, but it has scrolling and almost like Defender. One unique aspect to this one, like Mazer Blazer, is it had a unique control. It had this kind of wheel or dial. It wasn't like a wheel like a steering wheel, but it was almost like the rotary controller that Major Havoc had used, but instead of being long, it was kind of thin, and so you'd use that to change the direction of your spaceship, and you're flying over the moon's surface trying to protect certain things that you have, destroying enemies, shooting at them, and so just that dial would change the direction of your ship, and then you have thrust and all that. But I guess the most surprising thing about Moon War, when you look it up, is the somewhat racy flyer for it, where they were using sex appeal to sell the game, although none of that's in the game as far as I've ever seen from what I've played in emulation. It's kind of just a straightforward space shooting game, but I guess sometimes one way to stand out that arcade developers would do back then was to use a sexy model. And then last but not least, out of the new games that are under the Atari brand, would be Tazz-Mania. Now, I remember when I first read about this game and studying arcade history, I kept thinking it had to do with Tazz-Mania, the cartoon from the 90s that I remember watching, with Tazz, the Warner Brothers cartoon, but nope, has nothing to do with that, and it's two Z's instead of one. But the game itself, it's kind of like Robotron, but the walls are closing in on you. I almost think that they might have been influenced by the garbage scene from the Star Wars A New Hope, when the walls are closing in like that. And so that's what's happening to you. So you have to clear each room out before the walls smash you dead. But each room will have some new elements to it, like the Evil Eye room and stuff like that. But it wasn't exactly a twin-stick shooter. The flyer shows a single joystick on there. And so in that sense, it would have controlled like Berzerk, but the gameplay would have been closer to Robotron. Of course, Berzerk influenced Robotron and all that. So Yeah, those are the 12 games that are now under the Atari brand. Would you like to see any of them turned into modern coin-operated arcade games, or would you prefer to just have them as new recharge titles for the Switch or new reimagined titles, kind of like what Digital Eclipse did with Haunted House? Let me know in the comments below, and we'll see where this goes. But I guess one thing for me to end on is I have to give a kudos to Wade Rosen, the new CEO of Atari. He's definitely turning things around for the company as far as the perception of the brand, and doing stuff like this I think is a great way to keep earning goodwill with the old school collector community. But yeah, hats off to Atari on all that, and we'll see if any of these games, in particular Berzerk, end up in the arcade sometime here in the near future. Thanks for watching. We'll catch you on the next video.